University in 1993 and was a Division III football player at a Division I lacrosse school. And, everyone on my recruiting trip had talked about how lucky we were to have Bill Starr. So you do some research and you find out you've got a former Olympian, a former Olympic coach, and a renowned author in your weight room. And you quickly realize you're either on board and part of the group, or if you choose to circumvent his program, you're pretty much going to be ostracized from the league. The collective agreement that his word was gospel gets injected in you pretty quickly. And it's not personality driven. That was part of it. But the other part of it was just the sheer result that you would see by being under his tutelage. And I think some of those results are programmatic in nature. Some of those results were his ability to see and adjust as a coach. No card. Everything was from memory. The entire football team. He could remember all of your reps and all of your sets the week before. He could tell if you were looking fatigued or if you thought you had more in you. And then as you progressed, he obviously would toggle and adjust and leverage that big 3 5-by-5 framework to your advantage, right? So the big 3 5-by-5 meant different things to different people. And it wasn't as cookie cutter of an approach as a lot of the publications or the readings would lead on. But it was a big foundational element of his approach on how he trained.
Do you remember the first workout?
Sure do. So you walk in, he asks you how much you lifted in high school, and then he would laugh at you, probably poke you in the arm with his big pinky nail, and then he would tell you to get in the rack and you'd have your squat. And you'd squat to probably a heavy double or triple to failure, or until your form just completely deteriorated to the point where probably pushing injury. And then he'd have you go bench, and it was more the same. You'd work up to a heavy double or triple or even a single to failure, 1 rep max. There were not a lot of approximated max and a lot of overload. And then he would clean you. So you'd clean last on your eval, not first. And the reason is he wanted to look at your squat fresh. I had asked him about it. And then he'd ask you to come back the next day and he'd evaluate how sore you were and in what areas. And those were the auxiliary movements that he'd implement into the core. So if you were sore in your calves the next day, or you were sore in your hamstrings, it'd be additional posterior chain or additional calf work, or maybe you were sore in your core and he would attack that supplemental. And when you're going a big 3 max, stone cold like that, you uncover a lot of probably deconditioned or weak linkages in your chain. And that was how and then he set your weight based on that eval day.
Wow. Okay. So 4 years, college football. Did you have them all 4 years?
Had them all 4 years. And then I was lucky enough, I got turned on. So I was an above average lifter and I was pretty decent in the Olympic movements. So I kind of caught the Olympic bug my junior year. I was lucky enough to qualify for the American Open twice. I was lucky enough to bump up against Olympic trials going into my first year after graduation. So that would have been 1998, coming into the 1999 Olympics, right? And Starman said, look, if you help me in the weight room after work, Division III, so he would show up at noon and stay till 9 at night, I'll keep training you Olympic. So I was able to train under him for 4 years. And then my senior year, I kind of progressed into a pure Olympic lifter and a pseudo assistant coach. And then I stuck around Baltimore for 3 years and I trained under him and coached. And then we could get into, he also coached at another gym, which was an Olympic developmental center called Dumbarton. It was the middle school. Those stories rival some of the old York story. I mean, that place was insane as well. We could talk for days on just the insanity that would chase him around, right? Mystique of big weights.
I mean, and this is probably a good segue. Why don't you lay out Coach Starr's resume and where he started and how he got to Johns Hopkins and then is it Dumbarton you mentioned?
Yeah. So there are other historians that are probably more accurate on the precise. So rumor has it, you know, so he went to SMU. And I know he did not make the football team. He walked on, got a concussion, and wound up not playing, but got into training at SMU, and he became an ordained minister there as well. And then quickly became a high performance strength athlete and wound up at York Barbell and then wound up at University of Hawaii. Now, I need to fact check this, but there's arguments. Some say he was the first full time strength conditioning coach in the history of the profession. Others say it was Costello. I need to fact check that, but Hawaii is where he kind of delved into the amateur NCAA collegiate football world. He wound up in Hopkins. He's from Aberdeen, Maryland, and his mom was dying of cancer. And Starman never took a job that he couldn't walk away from. So his theory was, I don't ever want to have compromise my program because I'm worried about getting fired or not appeasing an administrator. So it was truly his way or the highway. And if you didn't like it, you could just let him go. And he never wanted to put himself in a situation where he felt like he was conflicted or had any type of financial handcuffs. So he's taking care of his ailing mother and he's basically volunteering. I mean, so we're talking late 90s, you know, I'm pretty sure his comp was like well under $10,000 a year. And he was making most of his income at the time from all his articles and all his reprints. For those of you that didn't know him, I used to visit him. He did not have a phone. So he had a fax machine. If you want to talk to him, you had to fax him, and then he would turn the phone line on. He'd talk to you. Otherwise, and he would only talk after 11 o'clock. Avid painter. No, he wrote a 1,000-page fiction book called the Susquehanna River Chronicle. And then obviously Defying Gravity, the strongest, along with all the other strength and health articles, the Milo articles. I mean, he played in CrossFit articles. I mean, he's still getting republished in modern publications posthumously, right? So lightning in a bottle for me. Like I catch him at the end of a career where he's willing to lean in. He's not looking to make big waves. Willing to work with you if you're willing to train under him. And there was a core group of us that would go compete Olympically, and we would dominate the Mid-Atlantic region. And when we walked in, people were like, "Oh, Stars kids are showing up." Like, you had like Katie at Monocacy Valley, you had Leo Totten, East Coast Gold. I mean, there were some heavy hitters from a coaching perspective on the Olympic circuit. And in typical Star fashion, we would buck that trend and kind of went out as independents. And it was a really cool time. And yeah, I don't think he gets enough credit for that side of him either,
Well,
right?
there's there's probably a whole breakdown on the York barbell aspect of this because from what I gather in Muscletown, USA, which is the history of York barbell, he was the coach of Bob Ben-Narski, who ended up being the first 500-pound clean and jerk who ended up beat the big Russian.
Yeah.
And that's not really talked about a whole lot of like he was influential of taking the baton from Bob Hoffman of York Barbell and taking him to a whole other stratosphere. And almost too, like, you don't want to give him too much credit, but you also too of like he was really good at zeroing in on people that would be much more proficient and capable in powerlifting and urging them and essentially creating a sport off of weightlifting and powerlifting. And he's a big influence on that as well, which is a crazy thing. I'm sure it's one of those like little like sidebar after mentions of like, oh yeah, by the way, he was the coach of the first 500-pound clean and jerk, like just, like sidebar, like not really that noticeable.
Yeah, I mean, between Barkley, Kono, and Bradford, right? All three of them will credit him. And he'll also tell you Dr. Ziegler was really important then too. And they were pretty tight. So
Yeah.
there was Thurman had a story about how Ziegler, the first electro stim machine from a training perspective was Ziegler created. And he said it was somewhere in like Medford, New Jersey, right? But he's gone, so no one can fact check me on this. we were talking one day and someone broke their leg pre-competition. It was like 72 hours pre-comp. And I think they broke a tib fib in training. And Zig stuck him in this machine and would toggle the stem 3 hours on, 1 hour off. And he did it for 48 hours straight. Now, this is probably star lore. He swears to God. They x-rayed that thing 12 hours before comp, and that fracture was healed. And he competed. And I wish I knew the name, but he will tell you. And I mean, Ziegler's also probably credited for bringing D-ball back from Russia, right?
Yeah.
Which,
Yeah.
Starman was pretty quick to talk about a lot of the York supplementation dates as well.
Yeah.
Awesome and frightening all at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, it's part of our culture, right? There's a huge historical factor of that, but you also got to look at it too of you can't you can't fault the guy for innovating and trying to find faster, quicker, more efficient solutions when there wasn't any stigmatism associated with it. Like the notion of just endogenous testosterone usage, relatively speaking at the time, was like taking creatine now. It was like, this is fair game because there's no alleged performance enhancing. So it's not like the same association, but also too, like you read a lot of his work. I mean, the dude, Coach Starr was almost a renaissance man if you're going to ever classify someone in strength conditioning as like the total package from the coaching, the programming, the nutrition, the supplementation, the psychology, the spirituality aspect. I mean, it's the full gambit.
Yeah, you nailed it, Tim. My wife's a PhD clinical dietitian. She read The Strongest, and she's like, "This was published in 1958,
Yeah.
right?" So much of it. All right, maybe it's not heavy fish oil pills. It's a different, but like from a macro micro perspective, he nailed it. And I will say this, in all fairness to Star, when he would talk about steroid supplementation, he'll tell you those York guys only took it either post surgery recovery, post injury recovery, or to pop a plateau. And then they would decycle and they wouldn't cycle again until they got back to the next record or the next ceiling. Right. So, and I'm not tied into the power systems like I was back then, but the ramp it used on the powerlifting scene, like Starman would say that's not how it was. And their training sessions were epic. And it was Bulgarian overload training a lot of time. Did have to have some predisposition, but it wasn't all steroid. And I believe them. Right? I truly believe that, most of the fruits of their labor were hard work and smart training. And then the rest was added.
Yeah, well, but like if you could get into this notion, one, like the things that he was doing, you mentioned how he was not going to compromise his values, his programming in any way. And that was a stipulation for any job you take. But it almost has this perception of like, oh, this is part of the culture and athletic departments have to tolerate strength and conditioning coaches because it's a fixture. It wasn't. And him being contrarian to keep what he feels valuable as well as like maintain of this, I'm pushing boundaries here. And if you put a ceiling on that, we're going to limit our growth and our potential influence here and just not compromising on that, like was way against the grain. Like you're talking, he's paying 10 grand at a Division III school. That's a clear representation of the association of what that position and the clout or the esteem it had in athletic departments and schools. And that gets high schools are dominating that like at this point. And that's like just shows a sign of the time.
Yeah. And, in all fairness to him, there was always like this stigma, right? Like they're going to get hurt down there. They're going heavy. They're not going to be able to perform on the field. And like he would always say, well, just come talk to me. Right. The other thing he was phenomenal at, you didn't have to be a phenomenal lifter for training. You just had to give great effort and engagement. Right. And I can tell you, my Monday workouts were very different than a lot of other guys. And he treated them just as well as he treated me. And we didn't have a lot of injuries. Tim, I'll tell you, I mean, look, we were both in the game. If I pulled my Hopkins numbers as a team from 1994, We were stronger than we went to national championship in Delaware, hop stronger. Any of those Georgetown teams, I'm looking to say, I think we had 55, 500-pound squatters at a Division III level.
Yeah.
I mean, we had at least a dozen 600-pound squatters. And by the way, it wasn't high. I mean, we were deep. So, well, we've talked about this too. If a one acts important, you got to work. And in order to work it, that program it can't function in Division I sports. The time constraints, the rest you need, he would not be successful at a Division I level with all of the competing priorities and all the restrictions that we put on these athletes.
So I want to dive into the outcomes here because, we're alluding to the fact that Coach Starr had incredible depth and a absolute level of knowledge and just foresight. I mean, you talk about trailblazers and people who changed the course of history in our industry. That's one of the key figures, but also too of the value of probably a lot of that was everyone was very clear on what the expectation was. It was centered off training really hard, giving your best every single time, never compromising on that. But also too because I'm on the other end of this of I tend to like to not intentionally complicate things, but I like to really stretch the limits of, okay, let's really challenge ourselves and put together a very comprehensive, elaborate program. But then we get to, and it's going to come off comparatively like simple, but this is a pivotal period for our gym and our members to really accentuate simple, not easy. Focus on what's in front of you. Know the assignment. I need to do a better job of iterating the most significant contributing factor to changing your body composition or getting stronger or just having greater mental strength is very clear of what the expectation is. And I want to kind of go into that collectively with your experiences or with other athletes' experiences who worked under Coach Starr. Was that like the secret sauce? Was like, let's not overcomplicate. Let's just focus on directly what's in front of us.
So he was masterful at competition, both direct and indirect. So quick to let you know what the person that you were competing for a job for did earlier that masterful at reminding you like what previous guys had done or where you were heading. Masterful at, so we'll digress a little bit. If there's one moniker that I think is unfair to Star is like the heavy, medium, light connotation. It was heavy, 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 right? The difference is the movements restricted your tonnage. But I went 4 years of college. I was sore every single day. It, there- and you've got to be willing to accept that. Yeah, not an easy thing to do. Like you've got to get used to playing uncomfortable if you want to train them. I mean, for some people, that's just not in the cards. And then he was big on numbers, right? I mean, nothing feeds success like success. And I think he knew I'll put 100 pounds on your squat in the first 8 weeks as a freshman. And when you go from 400 to 500 in 2 months, really hard to want to leave the room. Right. And then he knows if you chase that number, everything else is going to follow. Right. Your bench will chase it. Cleans get easier. Your front squats get easier. Then you start pulling. Overhead work gets better. I mean, as an Olympic coach, he was quick to linchpin in at that back squat. Right. It's the foundational movement, all fundamental strength. And he was not afraid to make you do that first.
It gets into this point of you mentioning it because that's a great note on heavy, moderate, and light. And that notion of you just train as hard as you possibly can, and I will control the ceiling here. That there's only one mode. It's hard, it's fast, it's aggressive. There's no like wavering thoughts going in that set. I will adjust the ceiling on which you can externally load it to keep you going throughout 3 days and 8 weeks.
Yeah. Like my light day was overhead squats, hang snatches, good morning. Right. Maybe throw in some lunges. That was my light day. But overhead squat up to 385 for a rep. Good morning, 275 or 315 for 8. You're still walking out like you just went through a meet. The difference is that doesn't compare to, you know, 5 reps at 585 on your back squat and then a 315 back off for 27 reps, right? When you rack up the tonnage. So the concept of tonnage, I think Starman doesn't, a lot of people don't delve in. It's the total tonnage, the rep and the weight per day that drives your overload or your unloading principle. And he would use the movement to toggle.
And was that a way to, like, decipher if, like, "Hey, that was a good day?" Like, I'm 'cause here's the other part, the just the wisdom a coach like that improves and working with athletes that, "Hey, I know a good day because Augie hit this much tonnage on this day with these lifts, and that's gonna lead to" he just can have this better intuition about what's gonna happen in 4 weeks from now because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And or if it's your heavy day and you got to make it up, right? So if on your heavy day it's 585 for three on the squat and you only get it for a single, then you're either repeating or you're drop setting it or you're making up workloads on the back end, right? But like you've got to get the work. So some days you feel good, you run it up, you got that ceiling. Some days, if it's a heavy day and you miss that, nothing worse than missing your squat set on a heavy day because the back end work is going to break you, right? And part of that's then incentive to get it, right? That in and of it, that philosophy in its of itself, feeds the number. And then your technical days are lighter in load by the nature of the movements, but it doesn't mean you're not tackling it from a neuromuscular perspective, right? People start. There was a lot of conjugate training in SAR's program. If you were around him long enough to get there, right? The basic 5x5 is pretty, at its core, pretty simple. But I mean, there is a lot of toggles you can pull as a strength coach and still be true to his core ethos. Yeah.
On that note, what do you think if Coach Star was alive today, he would wish for more with strength conditioning coaches?
Man, that's a great question. So he was a pure strength, right? Did he believe in mobility? Yeah. Is he going to take 30 minutes out of his workout? Do it? No. Like that was on your. Did he believe in speed development? Yeah. But he wasn't going to take 50% of his time to go over acceleration, deceleration, and top speed. So I think when you look at at the performance model now, that is the whole wheel, he was not going to spend time. He was big on nutrition and big on rest and recovery. He would talk about soft tissue repair, but he wasn't going to take the time to foam roll you, right? So, one, strength is the key. If you get stronger, you get faster. If you get stronger, you jump higher. So, make your money there. And I would say, two, you can't get strong in 45 minutes, right? Like the work rest ratio for him, 1 to 4, 1 to 3. You start getting heavy, full recovery. Take it when you're ready. You've got to be willing to commit to a 3-hour workout on a Friday. And again, really hard to do in today's framework, right? Times it's just not a luxury with a lot of either aspiring athletes, current athletes, or even, you know, general population. I don't have 3 hours to lift it, right? But in his program, if you really want to be successful, like that what it takes a couple
And then last question, what do you miss most?
stories, his camaraderie. Tim, he had an innate ability where on your second set, you could feel like garbage, and he would be like, "You got it today. We're running this." And in the back of my mind, I'm like, "No way." Right? I feel slow. I feel tired. And he'd be right. And then there were days where I'd be on my third set and I'm like, I'm going to run roughly my clean today. And he'd be like, you better back it off. And it was almost like he knew before it was going to happen. And I don't know how. Right. And I, I think I was a decent strength coach in my day. My strengths were different than his. Mine were more being able to relate. And I thought I had a pretty good eye, but just his innate ability know early on in a workout, mattered or not. I think it is much art of science and some of that God given. I wish he was around so I could ask him that question. And then just the know what do I miss? The knowledge share. I mean, the stories about York Barb, stories of all the competition, the training hall story, pre-Olympics, right? And he talks about Ken Patera yelling at Alexa in the training hall during warm-up sets, right? And they would just like come out of nowhere. And like that's gone. And there's so much he would talk about that wasn't written. And I wish I had recorded it or written it down because there's a whole nother book. I would love for all of his disciples to get together and just aggregate all of these stories and us do a compilation because there's a novel in and of itself.
It's awesome. Thank you. This was awesome. I we talked about it offline, but the 5 by 5, the coach star approach, the raw science of it and the thoughtfulness. Okay, I can spell that out pretty quickly. I can show that pretty quickly. It's the glue that you described, the intangible stuff, the experience, the full gambit of being trained by Coach Star and what that actually really means. But that's also the secret sauce in any strength conditioning program. It's a service industry, and we are serving athletes and clients, and writing a good program is important. Having good coaching your ass off is important, but the just the day in, day out, and bringing this incredible level of wisdom, insight, and just humor, and all sorts of great intangible stuff. That's the whole stuff I was really excited about to hear from you.
And then look, you're running an enterprise now. You're still motivating leads. You're still training. And I know you used the word earlier in this conversation, and that was spirituality, right? And the way he would bring the white buffalo into your world and talk about not just him, but other great athletes tasting that white, right? And the first time you tax that nervous system and either pass out or almost out, and then come out on the other side, it's like a rite of passage. And and then with that becomes culture, right? Then now he had a culture, almost cult. You know, you can't create that in a text, right? That's through experience and engagement and being true to your values and all the things you're doing well. And I know like the fact that you're approaching this in your enterprise, like Garman, he'd be honored. He'd be humbled. He would be ecstatic. He would always say imitation is the greatest form of flattery. And when he'd hear other people were talking about the big three, no, he wasn't shy to acknowledge it because of him. I mean, he didn't lack confidence,
Yeah.
right? So kudos to you for keeping his spirit alive and his ethos alive. And hopefully I shared some insight that'll maybe help you and your team as you embark on.
No, this is great. This is so good. Thank you so much for your time.
Tim, I miss you, man. I love you.
Miss you too. Love you too, buddy.
All right. Keep an eye on Ugar for me.